Wonderful. I think we can start now. Good morning to everyone at the live venue of the Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference, and good afternoon or good evening to those who watch us online from other places. My name is Elena Chernenko. I'm a special correspondent for diplomatic and security matters at the Kommersant daily newspaper in Moscow, and I'm very honored to be moderating this session. I would love to be joining you in person, but as I understand from Michael Mazar's comments from yesterday, you can see the virtual participants in even greater detail than those who are sitting on stage. Well, anyway, it's good that there is technology to connect us. This panel will focus on technological advances that pose challenges to us, innovations in delivery systems. In their opening remarks yesterday, James Acton and Toby Dalton mentioned some of the current headlines from around the world. The topic that we will be discussing today is in the news almost every day and every week. Just this week, we have seen that the US conducted a test launch of a rocket with experiments for hypersonic weapons development to catch up with China and Russia. Russia accused the US and its allies of carrying out programs aimed at weaponizing outer space, and at the same time threatened that Western space assets used to help Ukrainians fight may become a legitimate target for retaliation from Moscow. And somewhere in the Kara Sea, there is still the Belgorod submarine that left its base earlier and made everyone wonder whether Russia is about to test the Poseidon torpedo. So against this background, can we still say that plus ça change? The more things change, the more they remain the same? It's my great pleasure to introduce the distinguished speakers of this panel who have the expertise to get at this question. It's Dr. Laura Greco from the MIT, Mr. Greg Weaver, formerly with the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Dr. Xunxian Li from the Chinese Academy of Engineering Physics. You can find their very impressive biographies in the app. And you're also invited to use the app to ask questions later during the Q&A session. The question that I would like all of our three panelists to address first is, what implications do these new developments in delivery systems have for deterrence? Can we still count on the mutual assured destruction concept to prevent nuclear catastrophe, or do we need other means to mitigate the risks? Dr. Greco, why don't we start with you first?
Sure. Thank you so much for Carnegie Endowment and to our other distinguished panelists and everyone here thinking about these things today. So your question about whether the innovations in delivery systems will have an impact on nuclear deterrence, I think, has at least two parts. One question is whether they'll have an impact on mutual vulnerability to nuclear attack. And I think the simplest answer to that is no, the most reductive answer. The US, China, and Russia are already mutually vulnerable to existing delivery systems. Most of these novel systems, some of those that you described, Elena, are especially designed to either evade or avoid traditional ballistic missile defense systems or perhaps overwhelm them. Fractional orbital bombardment systems, or FOBs, maneuvering boost glide vehicles, those powerful ICBMs that can go the long way around and reach from unexpected directions. Those are, I think, a common element of those are getting around missile defenses. MIRVs can overwhelm them. You can do attacks on sensors in space with anti-satellite weapons. But they don't change that essential strategic calculus. I think, you might ask, why are countries building those novel delivery systems? One, maybe a hedge against future advances in missile defenses. We know that they currently are not very effective against existing ballistic missiles. So these new delivery systems don't add to vulnerability. But advances in missile defenses or precision conventional strike, the ability to do intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance from space and track mobile missiles, all those advances, cyber weapons, I think these new systems are hedges against those. But I think there's a second important dimension to these technologies that should be considered, and that's while they don't really fundamentally alter that mutual vulnerability relationship, they do complicate the management of strategic relationships and make crises, I think, more unpredictable. They're more complex, more sensitive to misperception and miscalculation. For example, if you launch a fractional orbital bombardment system, is that a space launch or is that a FOBS? You don't want to have misunderstandings. So on one hand, these advancements might seem to be bolstering the credibility of a secure deterrent. They also make the environment more risky.
Thank you very much for this. Greg, would you like to comment next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you to Carnegie for inviting me to participate today. So the impact on deterrence of innovations in delivery systems is primarily a function of the attributes of the individual systems. And so what I thought I'd do very quickly is walk through the three systems. There's a lot of innovation going on in delivery, but the three that I think pose the greatest challenges to deterrent stability. And so what I'm going to do is talk about very briefly about what they are, what the key attributes of them are, and how those attributes affect deterrence. And I'll go as fast as I can. The first is hypersonic systems, as was mentioned. All three major powers, Russia, China, and the United States, are pursuing hypersonic systems. The United States is not pursuing nuclear-armed hypersonic systems. So the key attributes of hypersonic systems is that they do give you ballistic missile infrared launch indications because they're launched on ballistic missile first stages. But their flight profile then makes them very hard to track with existing warning systems. And in reentry, they are very highly maneuverable and potentially very accurate. And then finally, they are very prompt, but to kind of dismiss what is a common fallacy, they're not as prompt as ballistic missiles. And so the key deterrence implications of the hypersonic systems that are coming into the system now are that promptness alone really doesn't pose a new problem because they're actually slower than ballistic missiles. But it's the combination of hypersonic promptness, more difficult post-boost tracking, and high maneuverability that poses a dangerous new attack assessment problem. The problem is that given the difficulty in tracking and the maneuverability of these systems, you can't identify what's being targeted by their ballistic trajectory like you can with ICBMs or SLBMs. And the inability to predict what's being targeted by an adversary during an attack poses new decision support and decision-making challenges when we're advising the president, for example, on how to respond or whether to respond. We can't be sure if leadership isn't being targeted with these systems. We can't be sure if key ballistic missile warning is being targeted or if key space ground stations are being targeted that all tie into our ability to assess what's happening. We can't be sure if key nuclear forces and nuclear command and control assets are being targeted. And these problems exist, frankly, regardless of whether the warhead on such hypersonic systems are nuclear or conventional, given their potential accuracy. The high accuracy of these systems also enables the use of very low-yield warheads, nuclear warheads, on intermediate range and long-range systems. And that thus creates new limited use options potentially for the countries that are fielding that capability. So in summary, for hypersonics, the sum total of warning and attack assessment problems I assess as being moderately destabilizing. There are some potential workarounds or countermeasures to the problems they pose, but the impact of the loss of the ability to do the kind of attack assessment we've been able to do in the past can't be addressed fully through countermeasures or workarounds. And then the impact of new limited nuclear use options may affect adversary or other countries' assessment of what their theater nuclear deterrence requirements are. Now let me talk about fractional orbital bombardment systems or multiple orbital bombardment systems, FOBs or MOBs. Unfortunate acronyms. So the key attributes of these systems are that, like hypersonic systems, you do get ballistic missile infrared warning of their launch, but there's basically no ability to determine what the nature of the payload of these systems is once they've been launched, or if or when a nuclear warhead will be deorbited to attack a target on the surface of the Earth. The ability to launch weapons into orbit during crisis or war to create severe impending preemptive attack threat, that's a key attribute of these, and then the very short or no warning of the actual deorbiting of such systems and their reentry. So the key impacts of these, and this is the system that new innovation that concerns me by far the most. The key impacts of this on deterrence are, I believe it's extremely destabilizing to create a very short or no warning attack mode that isn't necessary to have assured second strike. There's no reason to do FOBs and MOBs in order to assure a second strike capability. There are plenty of other ways to do that. These systems pose a threat of leadership decapitation or preemptive attack on other key nuclear command and control assets, including ballistic missile warning, as a precursor to a much larger attack, potentially. These systems could negate ICBM survivability based on launch under attack if they're deployed in large numbers. And I think our Chinese colleagues should carefully consider this as they embark on building a fairly large silo-based system based on launch under attack. So the bottom line on FOBs and MOBs, in my opinion, is these systems aren't in anybody's interest to deploy. And I believe either the P5 or the United States, Russia, and China should immediately ban further testing of these systems and possibly the deployment of them if we can find an effective way to verify that. And finally, the third system is nuclear-powered cruise missiles, which right now only the Russians are pursuing as far as we know. The key attributes of their nuclear-powered cruise missile is that they have potentially extremely long flight times because they're nuclear powered, and that could enable them to be launched without actually conducting an immediate attack. They could be launched and then they could loiter in outside an adversary's airspace and attack on remote order to attack downstream. The key impacts of that attribute are they may be difficult to detect the launch itself of these systems because they don't require a ballistic missile booster to launch. The loitering capability they may have enables such cruise missiles to pose a very short or no warning threat despite being launched from their homeland. And that poses a decapitation threat. The remote attack direction or possibly even remote retargeting of such systems creates the potential for third-party cyber interference in the operation of such systems. And that, I think, is a pretty significant threat of catalytic escalation where a third party might be able to take control of and order an attack that the owner of the system didn't originally intend. And I'll wait to talk about mutual assured destruction later. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Greg. Dr. Shali, please.
Thank you, Elena. I'm glad to share my views on this topic here. It seems to me that these new delivery vehicles have one thing in common. They are better at evading missile defense than traditional ballistic and cruise missiles, which helps to improve the survivability of strategic forces. They may provide additional possibilities for second strike capabilities. Some argue that these new technologies enhance the credibility of first strike, and that can undermine strategic stability. In fact, however, the military characteristics of these new vehicles suggest that they may not be as good as traditional strategic strike forces in terms of strike accuracy and are less likely to be a first strike weapon. They don't show a substantial breakthrough in first strike capability, and therefore will not fundamentally change strategic balance. There are also concerns that these new weapon systems, such as hypersonic weapons, could pose challenges to the NC3 survivability as well as early warning because of reduced flight time as well as the DLC flight trajectories. Technical experts, however, argued that missiles with a depressed trajectory from submarines may have a shorter flight time than hypersonics, posing extraordinary threat to NC3. In fact, the NC3 survivability problem is a long-standing and a common one for the nuclear powers. That's nothing new. For credible deterrence, all nuclear states must have robust and resilient NC3 systems. Of course, these new weapons have their own issues. For example, for hypersonics, many experts agreed that they have relatively high engineering costs and low cost efficiency. As for nuclear-powered cruise missile, missiles and nuclear pod torpedoes, their technical safety and reliability are still problematic, and they are unlikely to become a major component of strategic forces in the foreseeable future. In addition, some new technologies, such as hypersonic weapons, if used for conventional purpose, will certainly further complicate the conventional offensive and defensive dynamics, making it very difficult to control. Nevertheless, these developments will not directly affect the second strike capability and do not affect the deterrence balance. With respect to arms control of these new delivery systems, the avant-garde is currently covered by the New START Treaty, which provides some basis for further development of US-Russia bilateral arms control. As for other systems, we should watch their further development carefully. The ABM Treaty was once the cornerstone of US-Russia bilateral nuclear arms control. The US withdrawal from the ABM Treaty has shaken the very foundation of strategic stability and stimulated the development of these new technologies, demonstrating the offensive-defensive action-reaction dynamics. If we want to improve the future arms control regime, we will need to limit defensive and offensive weapons at the same time. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to all of our three speakers. We do have a bit of time for discussion, and I would use my privilege as a moderator to ask the first question. First, to Laura. Greg has already addressed the questions, and thank you, Greg, very much for giving us this overview, very practical. Laura, the question that I would like to pose to you is, what do you think about, is there any possibility to address arms control questions for outer space? Can we do anything about those uncertainties and risks that Greg was talking about? Or are any binding arms control agreements here would not be working because maybe, I don't know, the dual use technology factor? Or do we need to aim for some flexible, maybe codes of conduct, or do anything about this?
Thanks, Elena. It's a great question, and I'm happy to say that after a fairly long period of not getting very far, the United States is offering some ideas in this space with its pledge to not test anti-satellite weapons against satellites. So that's a good start. It's a code of conduct. It's not a treaty-based approach, but I think it's a good place to begin. I think a lot of the common objections against arms control in space, I think, don't always hold water upon close examination. The idea that it's not verifiable or maybe not in mutual interest, that there's no arms race in space, that's been, I'm sorry to say, a U.S. position for a long time, which I think it may not be a race, but it's certainly going it may be an amble, but it's going in that direction. I think, but I think, and as our colleague Sunshine Lee mentioned, I think in space you'll also have to think about offense and defense at the same time. So Ash Carter wrote a great article, which he was a great scholar, and I think we'll really miss his contributions, but he wrote an article which really still stands up and made the argument that as countries perceive other countries will not use anti-satellite weapons, they will increase their use of space for offensive uses. So I think that strategic logic is true, that you can't address half of the problem, anti-satellite weapons, without thinking through offensive uses of space and what the limits are, what agreed limits are, what can you do in space, what's beyond the pale. There's a suggestion you couldn't verify a space-based weapons ban, for example, and I think I'm a technical person, so I think most space-based weapons are probably pretty obvious upon inspection. There are categories which may be harder to distinguish, but I think that's largely political will. Should you want to do that? I think more intrusive inspections, I think, can get you a long way. And then, of course, there are areas, as you mentioned, I think you alluded to this, there are dual use capabilities in space which can be used for beneficial or at least neutral purposes, and things that can be used to attack other satellites. And I think that'll largely be a case for behavioral constraints. And I think those are, there are reasonable approaches to handle that part of the problem. So I think what's held this up for a long time is also sort of, hasn't been a real shared sense of what the actual problem is and how to solve it. So there are a lot of ways to come at that, whether it's an arms race, whether the problem really is crisis instability, whether it's a space environmental problem, we're worried about space debris. There's lots of slices to this pie, and I think it will help for countries at least to have a shared sense of what the problem is before we start to approach those solutions. But I think most likely we'll start with some shared sense of like code of conduct, rules of the road, which I think are very important as space has all these strategic capabilities and strategic importance both in the nuclear space and in the conventional space. And we don't have a really good sense of what red lines of behavior are. We don't have a lot of experience with each other in space, what kinds of actions are particularly provocative or problematic, and what an appropriate response to those would be. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, threats against commercial satellites that are providing essential services to those fighting in Ukraine. What would happen if cyber weapons or even physical weapons were used on those satellites? What's the appropriate response? And I think that's uncharted territory, and I think we really need to be talking about those. So I think, of course, there's room, I guess to summarize, certainly room for codes of conduct and behavioral constraints. I think eventually a real discussion of the strategic offense-defense situation. What do we tolerate and what do we give up in order to get constraints that are in our favor? And then, of course, I think we need to be talking, just having open communication of channels about appropriate behavior.
Thank you very much, Laura. Greg, would you like to comment on this too? And you also said that you would maybe give more comment on the mutual assured destruction concept in these new circumstances.
Yeah, very quickly on arms control. I pretty much agree with everything she just said. Although I think verification in space might be a little more difficult than you outlined it. But what I want to add is that in my experience, arms control solutions to destabilizing technology innovations are best pursued and implemented before those technologies are fully tested and deployed. For two reasons. One is it makes verification of compliance much easier with much less intrusive verification measures. And the other reason is that you avoid getting into the arms race dynamic that begins when one state deploys a fundamentally new capability that others view as destabilizing, and they respond by doing the same thing. This is why I think China's testing of a FOB and potentially MOB-capable system recently, combined with their continuing refusal to engage the United States in strategic stability talks to discuss the strategic stability implications of innovations like their new system, is both fundamentally irresponsible and profoundly dangerous. Both the United States and Russia, despite all our differences, and they are deep and many, have long ago decided that FOBs was not a fundamentally useful capability and very dangerous capability to have, and forewent that capability. And I think China needs to look at that history and get on board with that approach. Very briefly, regarding your question about can we still count on MAD to prevent nuclear catastrophe? So I think that question, with all due respect, is a bit poorly formulated, because the United States, at least in our nuclear deterrence strategy, we don't rely on MAD to prevent nuclear war. MAD is a condition, not a strategy. But that condition obviously affects nuclear deterrence strategy. We rely on deterrence, and that's not simply a function of mutually assured destruction. Deterrence relies fundamentally on convincing an adversary that they can't achieve their objectives through nuclear use, and that they will incur costs that far exceed any gains they can achieve through nuclear use. Deterrence also requires, and this is often forgotten, but it's particularly important, I think, in the circumstance we're in right now in Ukraine. Deterrence also requires convincing an adversary that continued restraint will not result in costs to them that exceed the potential costs they would incur if they escalate to nuclear use. This means effective deterrence requires we not deliberately or unintentionally back a nuclear-armed adversary into a corner where they perceive existential threat in a circumstance when if they don't escalate to nuclear use. But the key point here, going to the question the way it was asked, is neither the benefit denial nor the severe cost imposition necessary to deter nuclear use requires escalation to an exchange that results in mutual assured destruction. Deterrence strategy is also affected, though, and this is what I mean by how the condition of MAD affects deterrence strategy. Deterrence strategy is also affected by what Schelling called the threat that leaves something to chance. And under the condition of mutual assured destruction, which exists when two powers have large-scale survivable second strike capabilities, under that condition, the potential for uncontrolled escalation that would result in mutual assured destruction adds to the deterrent effect of effective threats of benefit denial and cost imposition well short of a large-scale exchange. So I just wanted to emphasize those points because I think, in the broader American public, there's a misunderstanding of what U.S. deterrence strategy is based on. It takes the condition of mutual assured destruction into account, but it isn't based on mutual assured destruction.
Thank you very much for this clarification. Dr. Shanli, I have a question for you on my own, but I cannot not ask you to address what Greg just said about the Chinese testing and the FOB. Would you have something to say on that?
Firstly, I have to say I don't know much about FOBs because I'm not an expert in this regard. I have noted that our foreign ministry spokesman states saying that we conducted a test. It's about some kind of reusable space vehicles. So I don't get any information from China side about FOBs. So maybe there is some speculations on that. But I don't think we should base our analysis on some speculations. Yes, we all know that some countries, both in Cold War, did conduct some FOBs tests and finally dropped it technically and militarily, or maybe because of other considerations. But at that time, the consideration includes its technology requirement, its military advantage, and some relationship between it and BMD. And so when you talk about the FOBs, you need to talk the relationship about the offensive and defensive. But so far, I have not get any ideas or signs indicating that China is developing in this. And another question I would just to say, to make a comment on Mr. Weaver's points about deterrence. He mentioned that U.S. strategy is based on might, but not rely on that. But I wanted to ask, so what do you rely, what kind of strategy you rely for deterrence? Not might, then you have to use war fighting strategy? Is that the really content of your nuclear doctrine. If that is the real content of your strategy, I think that's very dangerous. And any offensive and defensive dynamics will go too dangerously. So that will be bad for the future arms control. I think the ABM treaty and the relationship between offensive and defensive have been for a long time the foundation of stable strategic stability. If you lose that foundation, the prospects of the future dynamics among the great powers will be very bad. So I think the first problem we should to resolve when we talk about the limitation on this new technology, we should also to consider the relationship between the offensive and defensive. So that's all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xiang Li. Greg, would you like to address the question that Dr. Xiang Li asked?
Yeah, I'd love to address that question. So unlike China, the United States issued unclassified descriptions of its nuclear employment strategy in both 2013 and in 2020. And those are available for Chinese officials to read. We'd love to have a conversation with Chinese officials about their employment strategy in a strategic stability dialogue, but they've refused for some reason that is a little bit beyond me to engage in that kind of a dialogue. But in that unclassified description, we make clear that our strategy for nuclear employment, which is in response to a failure of deterrence, is to hold at risk what adversaries value most, consistent with compliance with the law of armed conflict. And we comply with that, and both those points are made very clear in our unclassified description of our employment strategy. So as I said, our deterrent strategy is based on being able to convince an adversary that if they escalate to nuclear use, we will deny them their objectives, and we will impose costs that far exceed whatever gains they can achieve through nuclear use, because you can't completely deny somebody from gaining anything through nuclear use, but you can potentially, through your response, deny them their objectives. And that's been U.S. nuclear deterrent strategy for decades, and we've been very clear and transparent about that.
Thank you very much. It's time now for the Q&A, so I'll leave my question to later if maybe there is still time. We do have a first question from a virtual participant, from our discussant, Dr. Tian Xiang from the Fudan University.
Yes, Elena, can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. We can hear you.
Yes, great. It's very nice to hear all of our panelists' very excellent remarks on the innovation, on the delivery systems and its impact on the strategic stability. And I think if I can just make some comments first. I think if I heard it correctly, Dr. Guargo believed that the innovation and delivery system will not make the MAD deterrence more vulnerable. And she argued that, for example, the hypersonic weapons, it will not change the strategic calculation. And we know that the hypersonic weapons usually, and in fact, we also have the advance in missile defense and maybe other new technology like cyber technology, which will hedge against the development of the hypersonic weapons. So it will form a kind of offense-defense balance. And for countries who have hypersonic weapons, it will enhance the credibility of second strike capability. So it's a good thing for MAD deterrence. And I think my Chinese colleague, Dr. Xiang Li, also echoes Dr. Guargo's point. And she also said that the AS80, the NC3 system is vulnerable, but it's a long-standing problem. So it's not a new problem raised by the hypersonic weapons. And the hypersonic weapons also has a low cost efficiency. So, we have Mr. Weaver, who believe that in fact, hypersonic weapons will be a huge threat to the strategic stability. And I will not repeat his viewpoint, but I think that he is right on mobs and fobs, because it's there's a very short time, maybe no warning attack, so it will and it's not used for sure the second strike capability. So I think Mr. Weaver is right that it's in nobody's interest in deploying such weapons. I'm not sure about whether China is developing such weapon, but I think that Mr. Weaver is right that we should have some kind of dialogue to make our strategy more transparent. And well, due to some political reasons, maybe we stopped some conversation, but I hope that in the future we can resume the conversation and make our position on this question clear. And I also want to touch upon Dr. Grego's point about the arms control in outer space. I think that maybe it is very I think it's important to mention that now the current discussion about the responsible behavior in outer space in the United Nations, which made good progress, and I think is welcomed by most of the stakeholders. Maybe the legally binding treaty is very difficult for arms control in outer space now, but I think that, for example, such kind of step-by-step mode, such kind of norms or COC mode will be more helpful to all of the stakeholders. And I think it's also in China's interest to join such kind of discussion. And maybe we can form some consensus first. For example, we should ban the AS80 test, which will cause a lot of like space debris. I think it's also not in everyone's interest. So I think maybe we can form such kind of consensus first and build, make it part of the responsible space behavior. And later we can have some kind of like legally binding treaty. And I think that's for all what I learned from our panel session. If I can have a question to our panelists, I want to ask, so what will the development of new technology, for example, the cyber and artificial intelligence, affect the strategic stability, and especially on those innovations on the delivery system? So I think that Mr. Weaver also mentioned that if we want to have arms control solution in those cutting edge systems, we need to hurry up, right? So that's my question for our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. There is lots of questions already in the Q&A line. So who would like to address the first question from Dr. Zhang? It's all addressed to all of the three speakers, right?
Yes, yes.
Anybody would like to go first?
So sure, I'll start and I'll keep it very short. I think the question was, what will the development of new technology in cyber and artificial intelligence, what impacts will that potentially have on deterrence? I think cyber is primarily a threat to high confidence command and control. And there are ways to defend command and control against cyber attack. And when I say command and control, I include warning systems, because in the American conception, warning and attack assessment is part of the command and control function. But I think those systems can be effectively defended against cyber. I also think it's extremely hard to envision how you would do an arms control solution to cyber threats. But on AI, I have significant concerns about the potential effect on deterrence in the future. So if deterrence is rooted in assured second strike capability in order to be able to deny benefit and impose costs in response to a nuclear attack, then the application of AI to making offensive nuclear forces more vulnerable to preemptive attack by being able to find ballistic missile submarines at sea and find mobile missiles in the field, I think is a significant threat to deterrent stability, and we ought to take a hard look at that. Now, there are ways to enhance survivability against that, but using big data and AI to work ASW problems, anti-submarine warfare problems, and mobile missile detection problems is a significant problem, I think.
Thank you very much. Laura, would you like to comment on the question or the comments made by Dr. Jian?
Yeah, thanks for the comments, and effectively, I agree with what Greg just mentioned. I think it's complex, especially AI, and the push to, well, another piece to that, assured second strike, the push to assured damage limitation strategies, or this specter of damage limitation strategies will push potential adversaries to more complicated, more proliferated, different types of strategic postures, which I think, again, becomes much more complicated. So I appreciate the comment that AI continues to push the confidence, the requirements higher and higher and more complicated.
Dr. Xianli?
It seems I would point out the types. First, I think most all countries know about the cyber security, especially for the because AC's vulnerability is a long-standing problem, especially under the new environment. But the arms control on cyber security is not easy. So I think the major efforts probably will be have to do within by each countries. First, to make their AC system, AC3 system more standard, and somehow to improve or and different options in this regard. Second, somehow we need to improve the second strike capability. If you have one robust retaliation capability, you need good AC3 system. You needed to go making a hasty decision when part of your AC3 system were attacked. So that's me for efforts it is needed to do to protect your systems and to improve your retaliation capability. And you have a strong retaliation capability, even in your system, the right, and you can just, if that attack is only partly destroyed, you can use it, but not just by some mistake. You can use some management and communication to clarify, to mitigate judgment on speculation. So I think efforts by each country and by some management is needed. Regarding the AI and other advanced technology, I think these technologies are developed very fast, but majorly these fields, nuclear weapons, these into like this special into their far there is no interference what about it, but we have to be careful and we use technology we to assess it lab and its implications for your nuclear systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xiangli. We have lots of questions in the Q&A line. When you ask your question, please be so kind to write to whom to address your question. The first one is a general one. It comes from Charlie Pryor. Are FOBs and MOBs a violation of the Outer Space Treaty? If so, how are the US and others addressing this with a PRC? Who would like to tackle this? Greg, Laura?
You want to go first?
I am not a lawyer, but my reading of the Outer Space Treaty is that weapons of mass destruction may not be stationed in space. And I think there has been a narrow legal analysis which says that if the weapon does not complete one orbit, that it was not stationed in space. And I think from a technical perspective, that's a dubious assessment, but I think that's the legal assessment. But I think it certainly, as Greg mentioned, that's not the primary problem with FOBs. Their strategic problem is the real problem. And I would be interested to know if that, I'm sure there was enormous amounts of discussion during the drafting of the Outer Space Treaty, and FOBs was a presence at that point. They could have specifically outlawed them at that point, but I don't know, and maybe you do know better whether that happened.
So I don't know exactly the negotiating history, but I will say the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated fairly early in the history of arms control. And it's a good example of a lesson learned in arms control, which is don't negotiate limits that aren't defined. So the lack of a definition of stationing a nuclear weapon in space, or a weapon of mass destruction in space, in the Outer Space Treaty is a huge problem with determining whether a particular application, technical application, is a violation. I think clearly putting a weapon in space and having it orbit the Earth multiple times would, in my view, would constitute stationing a weapon in space. But I don't know that, I don't know what the State Department compliance guys would say. But I think there's a good lesson there for negotiating arms control. And I think maybe one solution, an arms control solution to the FOBs-MOBs problem would be amend the Outer Space Treaty to make sure that it covers FOBs in all of their applications. But we could also simply negotiate a ban on further testing and potentially deployment, as I said earlier.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Joseph Rogers. Many of the innovations discussed impact strategic systems. How might innovation in delivery systems impact tactical nuclear weapons? Who would like to address that?
So I don't particularly like the distinction between strategic and tactical nuclear weapons. I think any use of a nuclear weapon has strategic implications. I mean, I understand what the arms control history is of why we have those terms, but I don't like that term. And let me give you an example. There are systems that are called technically tactical or non-strategic systems that I think clearly aren't that. So the Russian Caliber sea-launched cruise missile is technically a non-strategic nuclear weapon because it's not covered by New START. But a Russian attack submarine deployed forward can attack the continental United States with a Caliber. Similarly, their air-launched ballistic missile system, where they've converted the SS-26 into an air-launched ballistic missile, it can be launched from a fighter, but it can also be launched from a bomber. And but it's not covered by New START because it's ballistic and not a cruise missile. But it has the same range launched from a bomber that would make it fall under the treaty if it was a cruise missile. So I don't find that to be a useful distinction. These technologies, some of them are obviously not going to be applied to tactical, like FOBs. I mean, it's clearly intercontinental range. But hypersonic technologies are being used in that way. I don't think they have super significant, the so-called tactical versions of these delivery systems. I don't think they have super significant strategic stability implications, because if they can't range, for example, leadership, command and control, warning systems, they don't pose a threat to sort of central strategic deterrence, but they do have military implications at the theater level.
Thank you very much. Marian Mesmer asks, how technically feasible are nuclear-powered cruise missiles? It seems that their development has posed quite a few challenges.
Could you repeat that question? I didn't quite hear the first part of it.
How technically feasible are nuclear-powered cruise missiles? Because it seems that their development has posed quite a few challenges. You want to go for that? Or
I have no.
You're the physicist.
I don't know everything about all physics, so I've never tried to design one. They sound really complicated to me, and actually really dangerous to test. They can I think they have spectacularly failed. They have pretty spectacularly failure modes. So I don't know. They also sound just as a very dangerous idea, of course, a flying, loitering nuclear reactor. So that's the limits of my knowledge. I couldn't say any more.
So if I could add a little bit to that. So first of all, I think they're a really bad idea that are unnecessary. They're technically challenging to design and make work. Having said that, and the Russians have had significant issues with the system they're developing. However, my experience in watching Russian weapons development since the 1970s, really, is that if the Russians are determined to design something and make it work and field it, they will eventually make it work. They'll have a lot of spectacular failures. They may kill some of their own people in the process, but they will find a way to make the system work eventually. And that's my concern with the ground-launched cruise missile that they're developing that's nuclear-powered.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Tim Tees. Given the problems of low cost effectiveness and technological immaturity, how do the panelists assess the prospect for preventive arms control on some of the technologies? Dr. Xiangli, would you maybe like to take this one? And if you do, you might want to turn your camera off because your internet connection is sometimes slow and we can't hear all of the phrases that you're saying. You would have to, but please unmute yourself too. Greg, Laura, would you like to comment on this while Dr. Xiangli is...
Sure.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Dr. Xiangli, we can hear you now.
Yeah, actually, I have mentioned the arms control on the technologies because of this new technology has its own advantage and disadvantage. So I would say the prospects of its development maybe not too bigger. The country, for example, Russia, only deployed a certain amount of its avant-garde system. So there is no signs indicating that it will replace. the avant-garde system. So if we wanted to control this new technology, once again, I will repeat my point. You need to include all relative system together, especially defensive system, because part reason for the development of this new technology is the ballistic missile defense for defense system. So when you want to control this technology, you have to link to the control of the defensive system. So we need to combine both together for future arms control.
Thank you very much. Laura, Greg?
Maybe to broaden it from just the cost ineffectiveness of these delivery systems, whether there are arms control opportunities in this emerging technologies space, I think that there are. When we're thinking about cost imposition, well, I guess I was thinking about the space offense defense question. The space offense is actually pretty cost effective, I think. You know, when you look at, I don't know if this is the full explanation, but a reasonable explanation for the development of anti-satellite weapons by China and Russia, or a concern about the possibility of the U.S. fielding a space-based missile defense system. That is brought up as a concern consistently over years. Sitting from the U.S. perspective and as a technical person, I look at this and say, this is such a wildly cost-ineffective system, I can't imagine it ever being produced. But yet it produces an enormous amount of anxiety. And a very cost-effective way to counter a system like that is to build an anti-satellite weapon, which says, I could basically make your system ineffective for the cost of a few short-range missiles and a direct descent. So I think that is in fact, the fact that it is so cost ineffective, a space-based missile defense, and it creates so much anxiety in an action-reaction cycle, I think that would be like a place where arms control might be a fruitful discussion, especially if the United States could get something that it truly wanted to discuss on the table in exchange for discussing a space-based missile defense ban, for example.
Yeah, so the only thing I would add about this question of these innovative systems and the prospect for arms control of them is that, you know, our long history with arms control is that we're really only successful in controlling things if all of the parties interested in them come to the conclusion that it's in our mutual interest to not have them or to constrain them in some way, right? And I think if you don't have that as a precondition, then you can't expect to get anybody to agree to control systems that they see military and political value in. And so that's one of the reasons, and I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the need for strategic stability talks with China is really high, because you can't get to that place where you mutually agree that certain things are in your mutual interest to either forego or constrain unless you have a strategic dialogue. And it took the US and the Soviet Union a long time to arrive at that place, right? But we did, even though we were in an intense global political military competition and confrontation. And so I would just urge again that China reconsider engaging in that kind of conversation. The one other thing I'd just like to say about the need for innovative delivery systems to defeat missile defense. So yes, innovative systems pose different challenges for defenses. But I want to make one thing really clear. We have been telling, the United States has been telling Russia and China for a long time, since we withdrew from the ABM Treaty, that we have no intention of building a homeland missile defense system designed to defeat their nuclear deterrent, their nuclear forces. We know it's a fool's errand to try to do that because we're on the wrong side of the cost curve, even if we wanted to do it, and we don't think it's necessary because we're highly confident that our nuclear deterrent will be effective in preventing them from making a suicidal decision to launch a large-scale attack on us or our allies. But we know that that's not technically feasible. So my point here is there are lots of other ways to defeat the missile defense that is feasible than to develop innovative new capabilities that present new stability challenges. There are penetration aids. There are direct attacks on the system. There are overwhelming the system. There are building maneuvering reentry vehicles for ballistic missiles that don't have the same range of being able to go way off where they're originally targeted, but still defeat the missile defense. So you don't have to build a FOB system to defeat some hypothetical American missile defense system. The last thing I would say about that is I totally agree with what you said about space-based missile defense is even more expensive and on the wrong side of the cost curve. However, I don't believe that ground-based direct descent ASAT systems are an effective counter to that, because an effective missile defense system would be able to kill those ground descent ASAT systems. That's why Russia and China are developing in-space counter-space capabilities that such a system would not be able to counter. But they're also doing it not just to defeat a hypothetical future American missile defense system, but to go after the military support capabilities the United States has in space that enable us to project power effectively. They're a fundamental part of the American way of war, and attacking those systems is a fundamental part of the Russian and Chinese strategy for defeating the United States in a theater conventional conflict.
Thanks so much, Greg. We have time for one or maybe two more questions, and one I think is very important comes from Jonathan Gerstein. What are the weaknesses and strengths of existing export control regimes, unilateral and multilateral, with respect to mitigating the proliferation of these delivery systems? And what changes should be explored to improve these regimes given these proliferation risks? Who would like to address that one?
Well, I'll start. I think probably the most important measure to do that is to not focus on the delivery systems. It's to continue to focus on preventing the further proliferation of nuclear weapons. These systems are much less dangerous if they're conventional. They still have potential strategic implications if they are conventional systems of these types, if they're in the hands of a nuclear-armed adversary. But if they're in the hands of a only conventionally armed adversary, their strategic implications are far less significant. So I would focus first and foremost on reinforcing the NPT and compliance with it.
Greg, there is also a question addressed to you directly by James Acton. Could you address Dr. Sun-Xian Lee's point that from China's perspective, the warning time from depressed US SLBM launches would be very short?
It's true that the warning time from a depressed trajectory SLBM would be very short. That's not a new problem. The Soviets presented us with that problem in the Cold War. That's actually why US Strategic Command is in Omaha, Nebraska, because it's as far from the ocean on each side as possible. So, and that actually forced me for a while to live in Omaha, Nebraska, which I would have preferred not to do. So if we could have banned that, that would have been okay. I actually enjoyed Omaha. But that is not a new problem, and there are known ways to provide the warning necessary to warn national leadership of a submarine-launched ballistic missile coming out of the water with infrared. It's impossible to hide that. It's so hot from an infrared system. And if it is a simple ballistic system, it is possible to track those RVs once they're released and predict where they're going and provide national leadership attack assessment. It might be on a very short timeline, but it does provide a different level of understanding to national leadership of what's happening to them in that scenario than a FOB-MOB system would, or even a hypersonic system with highly maneuverable RVs would.
Thank you very much. We are out of our time. There's still many wonderful questions, and I hope you guys at the venue there will have all of the possibilities to discuss them in person during coffee breaks or during the other breaks. I would like to thank all of the three panelists and our discussant very, very much for their expertise, for addressing the questions, and for their time. Thank you very, very much for this.
Thanks.